Hello, my name is Charlie, and I am the host of the Mage System. So, today I wanted to talk about this little thing that I experience, and I call them subpersonalities, which is a term that one of my therapists used. But it's weird because I've never heard anyone in the DID community talk about it before. So, essentially, I guess I'll start by describing what I'm talking about. So you have your alters, right? Like I have me, I have Alina, I have Matilda, I have Robin, and then I have within me, under the umbrella of L, I have these little things that are all me, but they're different, and there's some sort of separation between them. I don't know the best way to describe this. It's kind of like, now, I'm not the most well-versed on OSDD 1A, but it's kind of like they're parts that are separate from you, but they still are like close enough to you to not be considered an alter. But they are more separated than to be considered just an aspect of you or even like an ego state. I don't really know how to describe it. So essentially there are parts of me, like for example, or I'll use like going into like a little version of yourself as an example, because that's one a lot of us can relate to, where you turn into a little version of yourself and there's some kind of disconnect there to where you can talk back and forth in your head between the big version of yourself and the little version of yourself with clear communication, almost like an alter. And there's some sort of emotional amnesia between the two of you. It's kind of like that. And so there are these like separate parts of me. And I know from C-PTSD all the way to full-blown DID, it's kind of a spectrum, right? So we have C-PTSD, well, DID, where there's separate identities and amnesia between them. If we go a step back, then we have OSDD 1B and OSDD 1A, where OSDD 1B is whenever you have fully differentiated alters with different names and appearances and whatnot. But there is no blackouts between, there is only emotional amnesia, where you cannot remember what it felt like to be that person, or you can't relate to why they wanted to make the decisions they wanted to make, or can't remember what it felt like to identify with that identity. And then there's OSDD 1A, where you have amnesia, blackouts between switches, but the parts are, again, less differentiated. So maybe it's like a little version of you, or it's somebody who looks very similarly to you, but they have a different name, or something like that. You know, they're just less differentiated. And then CPTSD is whenever you have separations in your psyche between perceptions. So they're different states of perception, just like an alter is, but they still identify as you, and you can still remember what happened. So like you're going about your day, and I made this in the video of how CPTSD is almost DID, which I would recommend watching if you're not familiar with all this stuff, but you're going about your day, you feel good, and then something triggers you, and then your mindset does a 180, and suddenly the way you perceive the world is entirely different, almost as if you were another alter and you switched. But the difference is that you still identify as you. And suddenly, now that you're triggered, everything seems dangerous and different. And then whenever you return back to your normal state of mind, you look back on how you felt then, and you're like, you don't exactly relate to it, or you don't even process it the same. Maybe you don't even, it just seems very minuscule of a thing to you because your brain kind of brushes over it a bit because there's a sort of dissociative disconnect. So I have discovered that I have a set of alters, right, because I have DID, but I also have this little thing that I have not told anybody about because I don't know. I guess I feel like it's weird or invalidating in a way, called the L's. And it's a circle of people, but they're all L. They're all me, but they're different. So how do I explain this? We can talk to each other and coordinate with each other. And honest to God, I can't predict what they're going to say to me sometimes. And they'll say something, I'll be like, what? And so they're like alters, but they all identify as me, and they all present as me, and we all sort of are very close and fill in and take over for each other. And it's very automatic in a way, but still very separated. And in the circle of L's, sometimes we get to a place where we're pretty smooth and we almost feel like a cohesive person and we forget about it. But then we start getting separated whenever something happens, and the L's are, we call it the L's are disgruntled. The L's are dysregulated, and now they're all separated from each other. Now they're all disagreeing with each other, and this person wants to do this and this L wants to do this. And I can identify which L is which because, okay. And some of the L's are kind of almost like the alters that I had pre-fusion, but they're still me. I don't really know how to describe it. Like Max and L fused. And there is an L that is more similar to Max, and there is an L that is less similar to Max. But they're still L, and they still both use the name L, and they still both look like this, and they talk a little differently, and they have a little different perspectives, and generally, depending on which areas of our life, they're generally kind of involved in different things, and they can kind of communicate with each other back and forth, and they have different interests in a way. And I kind of have to think about it like that instead of thinking about it of, oh, I'm just in this mood, because it doesn't work like that. I don't really know how to describe it. You know, like it's separated enough to where in order to heal and work with these parts, I have to think of them as separate people instead of thinking of them as one cohesive person. I mean, I don't think of them as separate people. They're all me. This is why I don't describe it to people, because it's hard to describe. But I don't tell people about it because it's just kind of a thing that I have that I don't share it with people because, number one, I don't want them to think I'm weird. Number two, I don't want it to become a thing because it's really not important enough to become a thing. It's just something that I have in my thing, but I feel like talking about it in this space because this is the space where I talk about weird things, and I want to know if anybody else with DID has this. But there is an L that is more similar to Max, I'd say, and he talks a little more like, you know, like I can't even imitate my own self. He talks a little more like, you know how I talk whenever I talk a little more masculine, and yeah, a lot more playful and jokey. Tends to dress and really only want to be perceived as a guy, and that's also where I started noticing the separation, is because my state of gender identity does change. And we're all comfortable being under the umbrella of genderqueer, but it does change and fluctuate. And it's not like gender fluidity, and that label doesn't feel right to me because there's a separation there. Because whenever I am in each individual state, I feel like, no, I'm not gender fluid. This is just who I am. I just am a guy, or I just am non-binary. I don't feel, you know what I mean? Like, because whenever you're in that state of mind, you do think it is the end-all be-all, because you do know that that is your identity, because you don't relate to any of the other identities you've had in the past moment, because there's a disconnect. But yeah, there is this more Maxish me, and there is kind of the me that's talking to you right now that's pretty typical and normal. I'm also having a weird dissociative experience right now where I can still talk and say things as usual, but I feel like I'm sitting in the back of my head watching myself say it, and I don't know what's going on. It's really weird. There is a little me, a little more Augie-ish, but it's still me, just little. And that me is kind of a girl. Weird. It's a girl. I don't know why. And then there is, and these two L's are very, very interlinked. So half the time we're kind of just a cohesive person unless things get disgruntled. I feel like such a freaking crazy person talking about this. but it's not something that I've tried to force myself to extrapolate from my brain functions. It just happened. My brain just noticed it, and now I'm saying it out loud. Where there is, how do I even describe that? There's a more assertive and closed off, but still pretty chill L that is really cool. And then there is a more open, empathetic L, and they do perceive the world differently, and they dress differently in some ways, but they're very similar. And sometimes they are very cohesive. Like I'd say right now, they're pretty cohesive as a person. Like I am those L's, but sometimes they're not. And there is a gingerish L too, but that one is kind of the same situation between the two L's that I just described, where it's kind of cohesive. But yeah, it really just depends if the L's are disgruntled or not. If they are, then the L's will start disagreeing with each other, and then they will separate enough to where me and the closed off L and the empathetic L can have a whole cohesive conversation where we cannot predict what each other are going to say until we work something out, and then eventually it will go back. But my therapist called these subpersonalities, and they're kind of a lot like PTSD parts in a way. But yeah, it's really bizarre because it's very dissociated. I told a story last video about driving with DID of like me going into this weird little headspace and having to stop and cry, and then eventually I was like, okay, I'm here again. I don't know what that was, because I didn't relate to the person crying, but it was like this little thing, this little person, and I was like, this isn't Augie, because Augie fused, and I know this isn't Matilda, and there are no other littles besides that. And so, and this little person kind of felt like they still identified as me, but I didn't relate to what they were feeling. So, and it was like there was this dissociative cut off, like it felt like switching, moving between these two parts. So it was more than just kind of my experience with PTSD parts, and more, it was different. I don't really know, but that's when I started thinking that there was some sort of disconnect between the parts. And yeah. So that's kind of what I said. Does anybody else have that? That's kind of one of the reasons why I'm making this video. And also just to, I do know that subpersonalities do exist. I guess. I know what they are. They're subpersonalities. My therapist explained subpersonalities are just like when your personalities have personalities, but they're technically not different alters because they're kind of just like different versions of that person in a way, but there's a dissociative disconnect. That's what subpersonality is. So I guess this video is for two things. To ask anybody else if they have this, because I know other people do, some of them. And I just want to hear about it because I've never heard anybody talk about their subpersonalities before. And number two, if anybody doesn't know about subpersonalities over there, here they are. And if you have some and you're relating to this, here you go. But the thing that makes I want to be clear that the thing that makes it different from just having really wildly fluctuating moods is that there's a dissociative disconnect, and there is a sort of conflict of interest in terms of the way you perceive yourself. Like, it's different from having a fluid sense of expression, because you can look back on when you're in one mood of expression, you can still look back on the other mood of expression and be like, okay, I still like that too, but I just feel like this right now. But it's different because I look back on those other moods of expression and I'm like, nah, this is the end all be all, right? You don't understand or relate to what that feels. I've explained emotional amnesia to you, you get it, but it's not necessarily always emotional amnesia because we agree on so many feelings, because we're very close and very similar and we're not completely separate alters, but you know what I mean? Anyways, I feel like I'm just rambling here, but yeah, I wanted to ask that, so I will see you guys later. Oh, happy Pride Month. If you have a gay friend, get him a gay cake.